The castle rises from the California hilltop like a Mediterranean dream transplanted to American soil. Twin towers pierce the sky above San Simeon, their white facades catching the Pacific sunlight. The Neptune pool spreads before the main house, its marble colonnades framing impossibly blue water. Roman statues stand guard. The gardens cascade down terrace slopes. Inside, medieval tapestries hang beside Renaissance paintings. Gothic choir stalls from European monasteries line rooms filled with Greek vases, Egyptian artifacts, Spanish ceilings. Over 165 rooms sprawl across the hilltop compound, each more opulent than the last. But beneath the marble and gilt, behind the museum-quality collections, woven into the very architecture, are spaces most visitors never see. Secret rooms, hidden passages, vaults built into hillsides. Observation points disguised as decorative elements. Storage chambers that became prisons for art. This is Hearst Castle, and before it was a state monument, before it became a tourist destination, before it symbolized American excess and ambition, it was one man's obsessive project to build paradise. The construction consumed nearly 3 decades. The cost became incalculable. The vision never quite completed. And somewhere in the building process, the dream became a cage. The man who built it found himself trapped by his own creation, isolated on his hilltop, surrounded by treasures he could no longer afford, ruling a shrinking kingdom while the world moved on below. This is the story of how Hearst Castle was built, the architect who enabled the vision, the workers who raised it from bare California hillside, the secret spaces designed into its bones, the parties that filled it with Hollywood glamour, the financial collapse that made it unsustainable, and the isolation that came with building your own private world. The castle's history is complicated. It represents the pinnacle of American wealth in the early 20th century and the costs of unchecked ambition. The building process employed hundreds of workers over decades. The hidden architecture reveals as much about its creator as the public spaces do. If you're interested in architectural history, the golden age of Hollywood, or how America's wealthiest families lived and built, please consider subscribing. I would also love if you gave a comment if you have additional insights on the story of Hearst Castle. Let's begin with the boy who would become a publishing magnate and the hilltop that would consume his fortune. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863 to George Hearst, a mining magnate who had struck it rich in Nevada's Comstock lode, and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a cultured woman who valued education and the arts. The family wealth was substantial. George Hearst's mining investments and later his political career as a U.S. Senator provided resources most Americans couldn't imagine. Young William grew up surrounded by wealth, but it was his mother Phoebe who shaped his aesthetic sensibilities and his collector's instincts. Phoebe took William on a grand tour of Europe when he was 10 years old. The experience exposed him to art, architecture, and history in ways that shaped his entire life. He saw castles and cathedrals, museums and monuments. He developed a taste for European culture and a desire to possess it. The seeds of Hearst Castle were planted in those childhood travels. The Hearst family owned a ranch in Central California along the coast near San Simeon. The property sprawled across thousands of acres of rugged coastline and inland hills. George Hearst had acquired the land in the 1860s, piecing together a vast holding from Mexican land grants and subsequent purchases. The ranch was remote, isolated by geography and poor roads from major California cities. But it had a wild beauty. Hills rose from the Pacific, oak trees dotted golden grasslands. Wildlife was abundant. The family used the ranch as a retreat from San Francisco society. They would camp on a prominent hilltop with views stretching to the ocean and across the surrounding valleys. Young William particularly loved these camping trips with his mother. They would pitch tents on the hilltop, cook over campfires, and enjoy the isolation and the views. Phoebe called the spot Camp Hill. The location was elevated enough to catch ocean breezes in summer, high enough to feel separate from the working ranch below. William developed a deep attachment to that specific hilltop during those childhood visits. After his father's death in 1891, William inherited the San Francisco Examiner, which George had acquired to further his political ambitions. William transformed the newspaper, embracing sensationalism, aggressive reporting, and innovative layouts. The Examiner's success led to expansion. Hearst acquired papers in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other major cities. His newspaper empire grew rapidly in the 1890s and early 1900s. The papers made him wealthy beyond his inheritance. They also made him powerful and controversial. Hearst's newspapers were accused of yellow journalism, of starting the Spanish-American War through inflammatory coverage, of manipulating public opinion for profit and political gain. The criticisms had merit, but they didn't slow Hearst's expansion. He moved into magazines, acquiring or founding publications including Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and Harper's Bazaar. The Hearst media empire became one of the largest in America. William Randolph Hearst was personally involved in his publication's content and direction. He was a hands-on proprietor, sending detailed instructions to editors, demanding specific coverage, shaping the editorial voice of his properties. This need for control extended beyond journalism. It characterized his entire approach to life. Hearst also pursued political ambitions. He served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives representing New York. He ran for mayor of New York City, for governor of New York, and harbored presidential ambitions that never materialized. His political career was less successful than his publishing empire, but it fed his sense of himself as a major figure in American life. Throughout his rise, Hearst collected obsessively. He bought art, antiquities, architectural elements, entire rooms from European buildings. His collecting had no clear focus or limit. If something was old, beautiful, rare, or impressive, Hearst wanted it. He employed agents in Europe who scoured the continent for items to purchase. He bought entire castle interiors, monastery refectories, Roman statuary, Egyptian artifacts. The purchases arrived in crates by the thousands. Hearst's collecting created immediate problems. Where to put everything? His homes in New York and California filled with acquisitions. Warehouses stored overflow. Still, the buying continued. Hearst's wealth seemed inexhaustible in the early 20th century. His newspapers generated enormous revenue. His investments multiplied his fortune. He spent freely, certain more money would always flow in. After his mother Phoebe died in 1919, William inherited her share of the family fortune, including the San Simeon Ranch property. He was 56 years old, at the height of his wealth and power, and he decided to build on Camp Hill. Not a camp, not a simple ranch house, a castle, something that would house his collections, entertain guests, and stand as monument to his success and taste. He wrote to architect Julia Morgan with a simple request that would consume both their lives for the next 3 decades. Julia Morgan was an unlikely choice in some ways and the perfect choice in others. She was a woman working in architecture when the profession was almost entirely male. She had overcome substantial barriers to become one of California's most respected architects by 1919. Morgan was born in 1872 in San Francisco. She studied engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the few women in her program. She then pursued architecture, becoming the first woman admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Her training was rigorous and classical. She learned principles of proportion, classical orders, Beaux-Arts composition. She also learned structural engineering, understanding not just aesthetics, but how buildings stood up. Morgan returned to California and established her practice in San Francisco. She designed buildings throughout the state, with particular focus on institutional and residential work. Her projects included buildings for Mills College, YWCAs throughout California, and numerous private residences. Her work was competent, well-detailed, and structurally sound. She had a reputation for solving difficult problems and working within budgets. Phoebe Hearst had been one of Morgan's early patrons. Morgan designed several projects for Phoebe, including work at the Hacienda del Pozo de Verona, Phoebe's estate in Pleasanton, California. The relationship established trust between the Hearst family and Morgan. When William decided to build on Camp Hill, he naturally thought of Morgan. In early 1919, Hearst contacted Morgan about the project. His initial vision was relatively modest by later standards. He wanted to build something more permanent than the tents they had used for camping, something comfortable enough for extended stays. Morgan visited the hilltop site and immediately understood both the possibilities and challenges. The location was spectacular. The views were unmatched, but the site was remote, high, exposed to wind, and lacked basic infrastructure. Building anything substantial there would require solving significant logistical problems. Morgan and Hearst began discussing what the compound might include. Hearst's collecting obsession drove the program. He needed space to display and store his acquisitions. He wanted to entertain guests in style. He imagined something grand, though how grand remained unclear at the start. The architectural style discussion apparently centered on Mediterranean precedents. Hearst loved Spanish and Italian architecture from his European travels and collecting. Morgan's Beaux-Arts training gave her facility with historical styles. They agreed on a Mediterranean revival approach that could incorporate the architectural elements Hearst had already purchased and continued to acquire. There was no formal architectural competition. Hearst selected Morgan based on their existing relationship and her proven competence. The choice gave Morgan one of the largest and most complex commissions of her career. It also bound her to Hearst's vision and his constantly evolving demands for nearly 30 years. The initial plans called for a main building, which they termed Casa Grande, and 3 smaller guest houses. The guest houses would be built first to provide accommodation while work continued on the main structure. Each guest house would have distinct character while maintaining overall architectural harmony. The site plan took advantage of the hilltop's natural contours. Casa Grande would occupy the highest point with commanding views. The guest houses would be positioned around it at slightly lower elevations. Gardens and terraces would connect the buildings. The Neptune pool, inspired by classical precedents, would be the crowning outdoor feature. Morgan began detailed design work in 1919. She produced drawings for the guest houses and developed structural and architectural schemes for Casa Grande. The Mediterranean Revival style allowed for white stucco walls, red tile roofs, decorative tile work, wrought iron details, and the incorporation of antique architectural elements. The style could absorb Hearst's eclectic collecting without seeming incoherent. But the style also presented challenges for the California hilltop. Mediterranean architecture evolved in specific climates and contexts. Adapting it to an exposed hilltop that could be cold, windy, and subject to California's seismic activity required careful engineering. Morgan's structural training proved essential. She designed reinforced concrete structures that could incorporate historical elements while meeting safety requirements. The planning stage revealed the dynamic that would characterize the entire project. Hearst had strong opinions and changed his mind frequently. Morgan adapted, revising plans to accommodate new ideas, new acquisitions, or new requirements. The architect's role became balancing Hearst's vision with practical constraints of site, structure, budget, and construction feasibility, though budget would prove to be a flexible constraint. Hearst's wealth seemed unlimited in 1919. Morgan began accumulating a team for the project. She would need contractors, construction supervisors, specialized craftsmen, and laborers. The remote location meant workers would need housing and support. The hilltop site meant every material would need to be transported up from below. The logistics were formidable before a single foundation was poured. Morgan established a site office, and brought in George Lors as construction supervisor. Lors would oversee day-to-day operations, manage workers, coordinate material deliveries, and communicate constantly with Morgan in San Francisco and Hearst in New York, or wherever his business took him. The communication challenge was significant in an era before widespread telephone access. Letters, telegrams, and occasional site visits had to suffice for coordination between architect, owner, and construction team. Construction began in earnest in 1920. The first task was preparing the site and establishing infrastructure. The hilltop required grading and leveling in some areas. Access roads had to be improved to handle heavy equipment and material deliveries. Water supply was a critical issue. The hilltop had no natural water source. Morgan designed a system that would pump water from springs at lower elevation up to storage reservoirs on the hill. The pumping system required pipelines, pumps, storage tanks, and distribution systems. Installing this infrastructure before building could begin consumed months of work and substantial expense. Power was another challenge. Electricity had to be brought to the hilltop or generated on site. Morgan designed a power system that could support construction operations and eventually the completed buildings. The electrical infrastructure, like the water system, was invisible in the final result but essential for everything else. The construction workforce grew as work accelerated. At peak periods, over 100 workers labored on the hilltop. The workforce included skilled craftsmen and common laborers. Many were local California workers. Some were brought from elsewhere for specialized skills. The mix included stonemasons, carpenters, concrete workers, tile setters, plumbers, electricians, iron workers, plasterers, and painters. Housing workers on or near the site was necessary given the remote location. Morgan arranged for worker housing, dining facilities, and support services. The hilltop construction site became a self-contained community during building operations. Supplies arrived constantly. The project consumed enormous quantities of concrete, lumber, tile, pipe, wire, and hardware. Hearst's antique architectural elements also arrived, each crate requiring careful handling and storage until installation. The logistics of receiving, inventorying, storing, and deploying materials required careful organization. The first building to rise was Casa del Mar, one of the 3 guest houses. Construction began in 1920, and the building was completed by 1921. Casa del Mar sat on the site's north side with ocean views. The structure followed Morgan's Mediterranean Revival design with white stucco walls, red tile roof, and arcades surrounding a small courtyard. The interior incorporated some of Hearst's antique elements, including ceiling beams and decorative tiles. Casa del Mar's completion provided functional accommodation on the hilltop. Hearst and guests could stay there while work continued on other structures. The building also proved the design concepts and established construction standards for what would follow. The second guest house, Casa del Monte, followed in 1921 to 1922. This building sat higher on the hill, positioned to the east of where Casa Grande would rise. Casa del Monte was slightly larger than Casa del Mar and incorporated more elaborate details. The building included Hearst's Gothic study, a room that would become one of the compound's most distinctive spaces. The third guest house, Casa del Sol, was completed by 1923. This structure sat to the south of Casa Grande's future location. Like its companion buildings, Casa del Sol featured white stucco, red tile roofing, and carefully detailed interiors that mixed Morgan's design with Hearst's antique elements. With the 3 guest houses complete, the compound could accommodate visitors, and Hearst could begin using the hilltop retreat. But the main event, Casa Grande, was just beginning to rise. Casa Grande's construction started in 1922 and would continue in phases for over a decade. The building was conceived as the compound's centerpiece, far larger and more elaborate than the guest houses. Morgan designed Casa Grande around a central core with two towers rising from the facade. The towers referenced Spanish church architecture and created a distinctive silhouette visible for miles. The foundation work for Casa Grande was extensive. The hilltop's geology required deep foundations in some areas. Morgan's structural engineering showed in the massive concrete foundation and structural system that would support the building and its towers. The concrete work consumed months and required pumping concrete up to the hilltop and placing it accurately in forms. The walls rose slowly through 1922 and 1923. The structural system used reinforced concrete, a relatively modern technique at the time. The concrete structure would be concealed behind stucco finishes, decorative tile work, and incorporated antique elements. But it provided the building's real strength and seismic resistance. As walls reached their full height, the roof structure went on. The red tile roofing that characterized the compound came from multiple sources. Some tiles were salvaged antiques from Europe. Others were new tiles manufactured to match historical examples. Installing the thousands of roof tiles required skilled workers who understood the overlapping patterns and weather sealing requirements. The towers rose above the main roof. These structures required additional structural work and careful construction. The towers would be visible from great distance and had to be properly proportioned and detailed. They also housed functional spaces, including water tanks, that fed the building's internal systems. While exterior construction proceeded, interior work began in completed sections. The interior of Casa Grande would eventually include the assembly room, the refectory, dining room, the morning room, the billiard room, the Doge's suite, and dozens of other spaces on multiple levels. Each room required extensive finish work, and many incorporated architectural elements Hearst had purchased. The assembly room exemplified the complexity of interior work. This enormous space on the main floor was designed to display Hearst's collections and accommodate large gatherings. The room incorporated Gothic choir stalls from Spain, Renaissance furniture, tapestries, paintings, and sculptures. The ceiling was an elaborate coffered design. Morgan had to design the room to accommodate these specific elements while creating a coherent architectural space. Installing the choir stalls required understanding their original context and adapting them to their new location. The woodwork had to be stabilized, repaired where necessary, and secured to the building's structure. Similar challenges attended installation of antique ceilings, fireplaces, doorways, and other elements throughout Casa Grande. The refectory, Casa Grande's main dining room, featured a long table that could seat dozens of guests. The room incorporated flags from Siena's Palio, choir stalls, and Renaissance artworks. The space was designed to impress while functioning for the elaborate dinner parties Hearst loved to host. Throughout Casa Grande's construction, Hearst made changes and additions. Rooms were enlarged, details modified, new elements incorporated as additional antiques arrived. Morgan adapted designs continuously, revising drawings and instructing workers on modifications. This fluidity kept construction ongoing far longer than initially planned. The construction workforce dealt with challenging conditions. The exposed hilltop could be windy and cold in winter, hot in summer. Fog rolling in from the Pacific sometimes limited visibility and made surfaces slick. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous. Men worked at height on scaffolding, handled heavy materials, operated equipment that had minimal safety features by modern standards. Records from the construction period document some accidents, though detailed information is limited. The isolation of the site meant medical care was distant. Injuries that might be minor annoyances elsewhere could become serious problems when the nearest hospital was hours away by primitive roads. Despite challenges, construction proceeded relatively smoothly through the 1920s. Hearst's wealth seemed unlimited. Morgan's organizational skills kept work coordinated. The skilled craftsmen produced work of exceptional quality, and the vision of what the compound could become drove everyone forward. As Casa Grande's main structure neared completion, attention turned to the pools that would become Hearst Castle's most photographed features. The Neptune pool was the grander of the two outdoor pools. Hearst envisioned something that would rival Roman bath complexes in scale and decoration. The initial Neptune pool design was substantial, but Hearst modified and expanded it multiple times over the years. The pool, as finally realized, was the result of 3 major construction campaigns between 1924 and 1936. Each version was larger and more elaborate than the last. The final Neptune pool measured over 100 feet long and held over 345,000 gallons of water. But size was only part of the story. The pool was surrounded by colonnades of Vermont marble. Classical statuary, including the Neptune group that gave the pool its name, were positioned around the basin. The marble came from the same quarries that supplied the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Transporting and installing the marble required careful handling and skilled stoneworkers. The pool's basin was concrete, lined with materials that could withstand water and chemicals. The engineering included filtration systems, heating systems, and circulation pumps, keeping hundreds of thousands of gallons of water clean, warm, and properly balanced required sophisticated mechanical systems hidden from view. The colonnades around the Neptune pool incorporated Hearst's antique elements mixed with new work designed to match. The blend of old and new required craftsmen who could work in traditional techniques to create seamless connections between antique fragments and contemporary construction. The Roman pool, located inside Casa Grande at the lower level, was even more elaborate in its decoration. This indoor pool was entirely clad in decorative glass tiles in brilliant blues, golds, and other colors. The tiles created an almost overwhelming visual effect, transforming the space into a glittering grotto. The tile work referenced ancient Roman pool decoration, but was executed with 20th century materials and techniques. Over 1 million glass tiles covered the pool basin, walls, and ceiling. Each tile was individually set by hand. The work required tile setters with exceptional skill and patience. The patterns were complex, incorporating geometric designs, figural elements, and gold leaf accents. The Roman pool's mechanical systems matched those of the Neptune pool. Heating, filtration, circulation, and water treatment all had to be engineered and installed. The systems had to work reliably while being largely invisible, hidden behind the decorative tile surfaces and in mechanical spaces below the pool. Both pools represented extraordinary expense and effort. They served relatively little practical purpose beyond recreation and display. But they embodied Hearst's vision of creating something that would rival or exceed the great buildings and spaces of history. If ancient Romans had elaborate baths, Hearst would have them too, but better. The gardens around the buildings consumed almost as much attention as the structures themselves. Hearst loved gardens and worked with Morgan and landscape specialists to create elaborate plantings around the compound. The climate was challenging. The hilltops' exposure, wind, and limited rainfall meant many plants required extensive care, irrigation, and protection. The gardens incorporated exotic plants from around the world. Palm trees, fruit trees, roses, succulents, and ornamental plants were arranged in terraced beds and formal plantings. The irrigation systems that supported the gardens were extensive, requiring miles of pipe and hundreds of sprinkler heads. The gardens also included statuary, fountains, pathways, benches, and other elements that created outdoor rooms and experiences. The landscape became as carefully composed as the architecture, with sight lines, focal points, and spatial sequences designed to guide movement and create specific impressions. Hearst maintained a private zoo on the ranch property that at its peak housed one of the world's largest private animal collections. Zebras, elephants, giraffes, big cats, primates, and exotic birds lived in enclosures around the hilltop and in areas below. Some animals roamed relatively freely on the ranch. The zoo required extensive facilities, specialized staff, and constant care and feeding. The exotic animals reinforced the compound's otherworldly character. Guests arriving at the hilltop encountered not just Mediterranean architecture, but also wildlife from Africa and Asia. The experience was deliberately disorienting, removing visitors from ordinary California reality and immersing them in Hearst's created world. Throughout the 1920s, construction continued on multiple fronts simultaneously. While work proceeded on buildings, pools, and gardens, Morgan and her staff were also creating the hidden infrastructure that made everything function. Water systems, power systems, communications, drainage, all required engineering and installation. Much of this work was literally underground, creating networks of pipes, conduits, and tunnels beneath the visible compound. The tunnels served multiple purposes. Some housed mechanical systems, others provided service access, allowing staff to move between buildings and deliver supplies without being visible in the ornamental spaces. The tunnel system was extensive enough that significant portions of the compound's lower levels existed primarily for service functions. Storage was a constant challenge. Hearst's collecting continued throughout construction, often outpacing the building's completion. Rooms that weren't finished yet filled with crates of artworks, architectural elements, furniture, and antiquities awaiting installation. Some items never found placement and remained crated for years or decades. Morgan designed substantial storage vaults into Casa Grande and other buildings. These spaces were built into hillsides or occupied lower levels where climate could be controlled and security maintained. The vaults held artworks, documents, and valuables that Hearst wanted protected but not necessarily displayed. Some vault spaces were elaborate, with controlled temperature and humidity. Others were simply secure rooms where crated items accumulated. The vaults would later become prison-like repositories for collections Hearst could no longer afford to maintain or sell, but couldn't bear to part with entirely. Hearst's private suite occupied significant space in Casa Grande's upper levels. The suite included bedrooms, bathrooms, sitting rooms, and private offices. These spaces were less formally decorated than the public rooms, but still featured fine furniture, art, and details that reflected Hearst's personal taste. The private suite included built-in features that revealed Hearst's desire for control and privacy. Observation points allowed discreet viewing of public spaces below. Communication systems enabled Hearst to contact staff throughout the compound. Locks and security measures restricted access to his private domains. These features, woven into the architecture, facilitated Hearst's control over the castle's operations and his guests' experiences. By the mid-1920s, the compound was functional enough for regular occupancy. Hearst began spending substantial time at the hilltop, hosting weekend parties that became legendary in Hollywood and high society. Understanding life at the castle requires understanding Hearst's relationship with Marion Davies. Marion Davies was a successful actress and comedian in the 1920s. She was talented, charming, and by all accounts, genuinely funny and kind. She was also Hearst's mistress in a long-term relationship that lasted until his death. Hearst was married to Millicent Wilson, with whom he had 5 sons, but the marriage existed largely in name only by the 1920s. Millicent remained in New York and maintained her social position as Mrs. Hearst. Marion Davies lived openly with Hearst at San Simeon and in his other residences. The arrangement was scandalous by the standards of the time, but Hearst's wealth and power insulated him from consequences. Marion Davies's presence at San Simeon shaped how the castle functioned. She was the hostess for weekend parties, greeting guests and organizing entertainment. Her Hollywood connections brought movie stars, directors, producers, and writers to the hilltop. The guest list for San Simeon weekends read like a who's who of 1920s and 1930s Hollywood. Charlie Chaplin visited repeatedly. Winston Churchill was a guest. Clark Gable, Carole Lombard, Cary Grant, Greta Garbo, and dozens of other stars made the trip up the coast to experience Hearst's hospitality. The weekend parties followed established patterns. Guests typically arrived Friday evening or Saturday morning. Hearst sent a car to collect them from the train station in San Luis Obispo, the nearest town with rail service. The drive up the coast and then up the winding hilltop road took over an hour, building anticipation. Arriving at the castle, guests were shown to their rooms in the guest houses. The accommodations were luxurious by any standard, with fine furniture, private bathrooms, and attentive service. But guests also received a list of rules that revealed Hearst's need to control even leisure activities. Meals were communal and scheduled. Dinner was formal, held in Casa Grande's refectory. Guests were expected to dress appropriately. Hearst presided at the table's center with Marion Davies nearby. Conversation was expected to be entertaining but not controversial. Politics, religion, and other divisive topics were discouraged. Drinking was allowed but not to excess. Hearst disapproved of drunkenness, and guests who overindulged might not receive future invitations. This was ironic, given that Prohibition was in effect during much of the 1920s and early 1930s. Hearst's wine cellar held extensive collections of European wines and spirits, essentially ignoring the law. The hypocrisy apparently didn't trouble him. After dinner, guests might watch a movie in Casa Grande's private theater. Hearst insisted everyone attend the screenings. He particularly liked to show Marion Davies' films, even though many guests had already seen them. The audience was expected to laugh at appropriate moments and applaud at the end. During the day, guests could swim in the Neptune pool, play tennis on the courts below the hilltop, ride horses on the ranch, or explore the grounds. The activities were recreational but also structured. Hearst expected guests to participate in organized activities rather than wandering off alone. The zoo was a popular attraction. Guests could observe exotic animals in their enclosures or encounter zebras and other species that roamed the ranch property. The juxtaposition of African wildlife and California landscape was surreal and memorable. The entire experience was carefully orchestrated. Hearst created an environment where every detail was controlled, where guests existed within his designed world following his rules. The hospitality was genuine and generous. The entertainment was first-rate. But everything served Hearst's vision and operated according to his preferences. Marion Davies navigated this environment with apparent ease. She was genuinely popular with guests, known for her warmth and humor. She also mediated between Hearst and his guests, smoothing over awkward moments and keeping things pleasant. But her position was complex. She was the hostess of a castle she didn't own, the companion of a man who couldn't marry her, performing a role that required constant diplomatic skill. The castle's architecture supported this controlled hospitality. The guest houses provided accommodation separate from Casa Grande, giving Hearst privacy while housing visitors. The public rooms in Casa Grande were designed for entertaining, but also allowed Hearst to make dramatic entrances and control sightlines and movement. The hidden architectural features went further. Observation points built into upper levels allowed discreet viewing of activities in rooms below. Hearst could observe his guests without being seen. Whether he actually used these features regularly or just wanted the option isn't entirely clear from historical records, but their existence reveals his desire for awareness and control. Communication systems, including early intercom technology, allowed Hearst to contact staff throughout the compound. He could summon servants, send messages, or make announcements without leaving his private spaces. The systems embedded control mechanisms into the architecture itself. Security at the castle was substantial, though relatively subtle. Guards were present, but not obviously visible to guests. Access to certain areas was restricted. Hearst's private suite and the storage vaults were off-limits. The architecture included features that funneled movement through specific paths, and prevented casual access to service areas or private domains. The result was an environment where guests experienced luxury and entertainment while Hearst maintained awareness and control. The castle functioned as a stage where he directed the performance, determined the guest list, set the schedule, and scripted the experience. For guests, a weekend at Saint-Simeon was memorable, glamorous, and somewhat surreal. They enjoyed world-class hospitality in spectacular surroundings. They also existed temporarily in William Randolph Hearst's private world, governed by his preferences and subject to his oversight. Most guests appreciated the experience and returned when invited. Some found the control suffocating and declined repeat visits. But everyone understood that Saint-Simeon operated according to Hearst's rules and reflected his personality in every architectural detail and social custom. Behind the glamorous parties and famous guests, the practical operation of the castle required extensive staff and constant work. At peak operations, the castle employed over 60 servants and support workers. The staff included housekeepers, cooks, waiters, gardeners, maintenance workers, animal keepers for the zoo, and security personnel. Many staff lived on or near the property in housing provided for workers. The domestic staff worked long hours maintaining the castle's high standards. The buildings required constant cleaning. The ornate decorations, elaborate furnishings, and extensive art collections demanded careful handling. Damage to valuable artworks or antiques would be serious. The kitchens operated at near restaurant scale to feed Hearst's household, guests, and staff. Meals for weekend parties involved serving dozens of people, multiple courses in formal style. The kitchen staff needed skills comparable to high-end restaurant workers. Producing elaborate dinners in a hilltop location far from suppliers added logistical challenges. The gardens required full-time care. Watering, pruning, planting, and maintaining the exotic and temperamental plants was labor-intensive. The irrigation systems needed monitoring and repair. The statuary and fountains required cleaning and maintenance. A team of gardeners worked year-round to keep the grounds in showcase condition. The zoo employed specialized keepers who understood exotic animal care, feeding carnivores, maintaining enclosures, providing veterinary care, and ensuring animal welfare required dedicated staff with appropriate expertise. The zoo was expensive to maintain and served primarily as entertainment for Hearst and his guests. Maintenance of the buildings and infrastructure was ongoing. The castle's remote location and exposure to weather required constant attention to prevent deterioration. Roofs needed periodic repair. Stucco required maintenance. The water and power systems needed monitoring. Mechanical equipment required service. A maintenance crew handled repairs and ongoing upkeep. The cost of operating the castle was enormous. Payroll for 60-plus employees, food for elaborate entertaining, utilities for the vast buildings, maintenance of the structures and grounds, care for exotic animals, all added up to staggering monthly expenses. In the prosperous 1920s, Hearst's income from his media empire easily covered these costs. The castle was an expensive indulgence, but one he could afford. The construction costs during the 1920s were also substantial. Morgan's office maintained detailed financial records. The expenses for materials, labor, and Morgan's architectural fees ran into millions of dollars in 1920s currency. Adjusted for inflation, the construction costs through the 1920s would be equivalent to tens or hundreds of millions in modern dollars. Hearst apparently paid Morgan's invoices without complaint during this period. Money was available. The projects continued. When Morgan presented designs for improvements or additions, Hearst typically approved them. The construction consumed wealth, but more wealth flowed in from newspapers, magazines, and investments. The castle also served Hearst's business purposes to some extent. The weekend parties included influential figures from politics, business, and entertainment. The castle provided a venue for Hearst to network, influence opinion, and maintain his position as a major American power broker. The hospitality had business utility beyond mere pleasure, but the primary purpose was personal. Hearst built the castle because he wanted it. The collections housed there satisfied his collector's obsession. The architecture embodied his vision of appropriate grandeur. The hospitality showcased his generosity and influence. The entire project served his ego and his desire to create a personal paradise. By 1930, the castle had consumed approximately a decade of intensive construction and millions of dollars. Casa Grande stood complete externally and largely finished internally. The 3 guest houses were fully operational. The Neptune pool was in its second iteration and spectacular. The Roman pool glittered with its million glass tiles. The gardens were mature and beautiful. The compound had become what Hearst envisioned, a Mediterranean-inspired retreat housing world-class art collections and providing venues for entertainment. Construction continued on refinements and additions, but the major elements were in place. But economic storm clouds were gathering. The stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression would affect even the wealthiest Americans. Hearst's media empire would face challenges. His spending would eventually outpace even his substantial income, and the castle that represented the pinnacle of his success would become increasingly difficult to sustain. The financial pressures built gradually through the 1930s. The Depression reduced advertising revenue for Hearst's newspapers and magazines. Competition increased as radio emerged as a new medium. Hearst's business empire, which had seemed unassailable in the 1920s, faced genuine threats. But Hearst didn't reduce spending immediately. Construction at San Simeon continued through the early 1930s. The Neptune pool was rebuilt in its third and final form between 1934 and 1936. Hearst's collecting continued. The parties went on. The operational costs remained astronomical. The disconnect between economic reality and Hearst's spending became increasingly severe. By 1937, the situation reached crisis. Hearst's corporate empire faced potential bankruptcy. His holding company, which controlled the various newspapers, magazines, and other properties, carried enormous debt. The revenue couldn't service the debt while also funding Hearst's personal spending. Something had to give. The solution was painful and humiliating for a man accustomed to unlimited resources. Hearst had to sell assets. He had to reduce expenses. He had to accept financial oversight from executives brought in to restructure his business empire. The sale of assets began with peripheral properties, but quickly moved to things Hearst valued personally. Real estate holdings were sold. Some newspapers and magazines were shuttered or sold. And the art collection, the accumulation of decades of obsessive buying, had to be liquidated. The art sales were managed through Gimbel's department store in New York, which created a Hearst warehouse where items from the collection were sold at retail. The humiliation of seeing museum-quality artworks and antiques sold in a department store basement was profound. Items Hearst had acquired for substantial sums sold for fractions of their purchase prices. Many pieces never sold and remained in storage. The financial crisis forced cancellation of most construction at San Simeon. Work that had continued for nearly 2 decades stopped abruptly. Julia Morgan's last major invoice was dated 1937. After that, only minimal maintenance work continued. The relationship between Morgan and Hearst, which had spanned almost 20 years and produced one of America's most extraordinary architectural complexes, ended not with completion of a grand vision, but with financial necessity forcing an abrupt halt. Morgan reportedly never received full payment for all her work. She accepted the situation with characteristic professionalism, closing out her accounts and moving on to other projects. The castle she had designed and supervised would remain forever incomplete in some respects. With Hearst's endless modifications and additions finally stopped by financial reality rather than satisfied ambition, the household staff was reduced drastically. Many longtime employees were let go. The remaining staff maintained the buildings and grounds at a reduced level. The zoo was largely disbanded, with animals sold or donated to municipal zoos. Some animals remained, but the elaborate collection was ended. The entertaining continued, but at reduced scale. The weekend parties became less frequent and smaller. Some of the famous guests stopped coming, whether because invitations ceased or because the reduced circumstances made visits less appealing. The hilltop that had been animated by constant construction, elaborate parties, and dozens of staff members became quieter. Marion Davies's role during the financial crisis revealed the depth of her relationship with Hearst. She provided financial support from her own earnings and savings. She sold jewelry and property to help Hearst maintain some independence. Her loyalty during his decline stood in contrast to many fair-weather friends who disappeared when Hearst's fortune faltered. The aid Marion provided was substantial and genuine. She received little public recognition for it at the time, and the support complicated her own financial position. But she apparently gave it freely, motivated by genuine affection rather than expectation of return. Hearst's reduced circumstances didn't completely impoverish him. He retained substantial wealth compared to ordinary Americans. But the psychological impact of financial constraints after decades of unlimited spending was severe. A man who had never been told he couldn't afford something now faced budgets and oversight. The castle at Saint-Simeon, which had represented the pinnacle of his success, became a reminder of lost wealth and constrained ambition. The secret rooms and storage vaults took on new meaning during this period. The vaults that had stored overflow from Hearst's collecting now held items that couldn't be sold quickly or that Hearst couldn't bear to part with despite financial necessity. Crated artworks and antiques accumulated in storage, valuable but inaccessible, neither displayed nor monetized. The storage spaces became prisons for possessions Hearst had acquired but could no longer properly maintain or enjoy. The architecture that had enabled his control and oversight now emphasized his isolation. The observation points that had let him watch over guests now looked out over emptier rooms. The communication systems connected fewer staff members. The tunnels that had bustled with servants now echoed with reduced activity. World War II further isolated Saint-Simeon. The California coast was considered potentially vulnerable to Japanese attack. Blackout requirements and security concerns made entertaining impractical. Hearst and Davies spent much of the war period at his property in Wintun in Northern California, leaving Saint-Simeon largely shuttered. The castle that had required 60 staff members to operate sat mostly empty and silent. By the late 1940s, Hearst's health was declining. He was in his 80s, and decades of indulgent living had taken their toll. His doctors recommended he leave Saint-Simeon's hilltop location for some place with easier access to medical care. In 1947, Hearst left Saint-Simeon for the last time. He moved to a house in Beverly Hills where Marion Davies could be nearby and medical care was immediately available. He would never return to the hilltop. Hearst died in 1951 at age 88. His death ended an era and left his family with the problem of what to do with Saint-Simeon. The castle couldn't be sold easily. Who would buy an enormous, idiosyncratic property on a remote California hilltop? The operational costs remained substantial even with minimal staffing. The Hearst family couldn't afford to maintain it as a private residence, but disposing of it posed challenges. The Hearst Corporation, the restructured business empire that had emerged from the 1930s crisis, didn't want the property either. It was a liability rather than an asset, expensive to maintain and generating no revenue. The solution emerged gradually. The state of California expressed interest in accepting the property as a donation. The castle would become a state park and historical monument. The public would be able to visit and tour the buildings and grounds. The arrangement would preserve the property while removing the burden from the Hearst family. Negotiations proceeded through the 1950s. The details were complex, involving questions about what would be included in the donation, how the property would be managed, what access the Hearst family would retain, and how the state would fund operations and maintenance. An agreement was finally reached in 1957. The Hearst Corporation donated the castle, grounds, and significant portions of the art collection to the state of California. The transfer was completed in 1958. San Simeon became a California state park, officially named Hearst San Simeon State Historical Monument. The transformation from private residence to public monument required substantial work. The buildings needed assessment and stabilization. Systems needed updating for public safety and accessibility. Tour routes had to be designed. Interpretive materials needed development. Staff had to be hired and trained. The California Department of Parks and Recreation took on these tasks through the late 1950s and early 1960s. Public tours began in 1958, initially on a limited basis. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The public was fascinated by the opportunity to see how one of America's wealthiest and most powerful men had lived. The castle's architectural splendor and the art collections drew visitors from across California and eventually the nation. The tours initially focused on the public rooms in Casa Grande and portions of the guest houses. The secret rooms, storage vaults, and service areas remained off limits. This was partly practical, as these spaces required more extensive preparation for public access, and partly intentional, as some mystery added to the castle's appeal. Over subsequent decades, additional tours were developed that provided access to previously restricted areas. The upstairs suites tour showed Hearst's private quarters. The evening tour allowed visitors to experience the castle after dark. Special tours explored the grounds and gardens more extensively, but some spaces remained restricted. The deepest storage vaults, certain mechanical areas, and some of the tunnel systems were never open to regular public access. These hidden spaces remained mysterious, known only through documentation and to preservation staff who occasionally accessed them for maintenance or conservation work. Modern visitors to Hearst Castle experience a carefully curated version of Hearst's world. The tour guides provide historical context and architectural information. The rooms are maintained in states that approximate how they appeared during Hearst's occupancy. The art collections are preserved and protected, but the experience is necessarily different from what Hearst's guests encountered. The tours follow prescribed routes and schedules. Visitors move through spaces in groups rather than wandering freely. The buildings are museums rather than homes. The atmosphere is respectful and educational rather than purely recreational. The contrast between what visitors see and what remains hidden highlights the castle's layered nature. The public rooms represent Hearst's public face, the grandeur he wanted to display. The hidden spaces represent the infrastructure and control mechanisms that made that display possible. Understanding the castle fully requires awareness of both aspects, the visible and the concealed. The storage vaults remain fascinating mysteries. Some are accessible to researchers and preservation staff who document their contents. The vaults still contain crated artworks, furniture, and architectural elements that were never installed. Some items have been cataloged and incorporated into rotating displays. Others remain crated, their contents uncertain without opening them. The conservation challenge these stored items present is substantial. Many have been in less than ideal conditions for decades. The crates themselves may be deteriorating. Opening and assessing everything would require enormous resources and specialized expertise. The work proceeds slowly as funding and staff time allow. The tunnels and service passages reveal how the castle actually functioned. These utilitarian spaces contrast sharply with the ornate public rooms. Bare concrete walls, pipes, electrical conduits, and mechanical equipment show the infrastructure that supported the luxurious life above. Walking through these spaces provides perspective on how many workers and how much equipment were necessary to create the illusion of effortless magnificence. Some secret rooms were designed for specific purposes that remain unclear. Speculation exists about observation points, private viewing rooms, or secure storage for particularly valuable or sensitive items. Without detailed documentation from Hearst or Morgan, the purposes of some spaces remain matters of interpretation. The ambiguity adds to the castle's mystique. The castle's architecture reveals Hearst's personality in ways that straightforward biography might miss. The need for control evident in observation points and communication systems. The collector's obsession visible in overflowing storage vaults. The desire for both society in isolation reflected in guest houses positioned near but separate from the main house. The architecture made manifest Hearst's contradictions and complexities. Julia Morgan's contribution becomes clearer with historical distance. She enabled Hearst's vision while also tempering his excesses with structural reality and architectural discipline. She solved enormous logistical challenges and created buildings that have endured for nearly a century. Her work on San Simeon represents a major achievement in American architecture, though one complicated by the client's personality and ultimate financial collapse. The workers who built the castle remain largely anonymous in historical accounts. Some names appear in payroll records and correspondence, but most individuals who labored on the hilltop are unknown. They cut stone, poured concrete, set tiles, hung plaster, and performed thousands of tasks that made the vision real. Their work endures in every wall and surface, though their stories are mostly lost. Modern preservation efforts continue the work that began in 1920. The buildings require constant maintenance. The harsh hilltop environment degrades materials continuously. Salt air from the ocean corrodes metal. Sunlight fades colors. Water infiltration threatens structures. Wind damages roofs and ornamental elements. The preservation staff fights ongoing battles against deterioration, using techniques that balance historical authenticity with practical necessity. Climate control in the buildings is challenging. The structures weren't designed with modern HVAC systems. Installing such systems without damaging historical fabric requires creative solutions. Maintaining appropriate temperature and humidity to preserve artworks and furnishings while also allowing public access involves complex trade-offs. The Neptune pool requires extensive maintenance. The marble and tile surfaces need regular cleaning and repair. The mechanical systems that circulate and heat the water need ongoing service. The pool is drained periodically for major maintenance, revealing the complexity of the structure beneath its placid surface. The Roman pool's glass tiles are delicate and irreplaceable in many cases. Cleaning must be gentle to avoid damaging the tiles or their gold leaf elements. Water chemistry must be carefully controlled to prevent chemical damage. The pool represents an ongoing conservation challenge that requires specialized expertise. The gardens demand continuous care, as they did during Hearst's lifetime. Plants need watering, pruning, and periodic replacement. The irrigation systems require maintenance and updating. Balancing historical accuracy with modern water conservation creates tension between preservation philosophy and environmental responsibility. The castle attracts nearly 1 million visitors annually. The visitor volume creates its own challenges. Foot traffic wears carpets and floors, touching damages surfaces. The humidity and carbon dioxide from breathing bodies affects interior environments. Managing public access while preserving historical fabric requires constant attention. The interpretation of Hearst's life and the castle's history has evolved over decades. Early tours focused heavily on architectural splendor and collection highlights, treating Hearst reverentially as a major figure. Later interpretation became more nuanced, addressing his controversial journalism, his affair with Marion Davies, and his financial collapse. Current interpretation attempts balanced presentation that acknowledges both achievements and failings. The castle's role in popular culture has kept it prominent in public awareness. Films and television shows have been shot on location or reference the castle. Citizen Kane, Orson Welles' thinly veiled fictionalization of Hearst's life, created a cinematic interpretation that many people associate with the real castle, though the film's Xanadu was a studio creation rather than footage of San Simeon. The castle appears in documentaries about architecture, California history, the Gilded Age, and Hollywood's golden era. Each appearance reinforces its status as an icon of American wealth and ambition. The repeated exposure keeps new generations aware of Hearst and his hilltop creation. Academic research continues revealing new information about the castle's construction and history. Scholars examine Julia Morgan's papers, study Hearst's correspondence, and analyze construction documents. The research produces new insights about construction methods, design evolution, and the relationship between architect and client. The castle serves as a case study in multiple academic disciplines. Architectural historians study Morgan's work and the Mediterranean Revival style. Business historians examine Hearst's empire and its collapse. Social historians explore the lifestyle and entertaining customs. Cultural critics analyze what the castle reveals about American values and aspirations. The question of what the castle represents remains contested. Is it a testament to American ambition and achievement? A monument to excess and ego? A prison of gold built by a man who confused wealth with happiness? A fascinating architectural experiment? An elaborate folly? Perhaps it's all of these simultaneously. The castle embodies contradictions that resist simple interpretation. The secret rooms particularly resist easy understanding. Why did Hearst want observation points and hidden passages? Was he paranoid? Simply controlling? Creating theatrical experiences? Indulging in fantasy? The architectural choices suggest someone who wanted to see without being seen, to control without being obviously controlling, to maintain private spaces even while entertaining. The storage vaults filled with uncatalogued crates raise questions about collecting and ownership. Hearst bought thousands of artworks and antiques, more than he could ever display or even inventory properly. The buying seemed to satisfy a need that had little to do with appreciation or enjoyment. Possession itself was the goal. The vaults full of unopened crates represent the pathology of extreme collecting, accumulation for its own sake. The castle's transformation from private residence to public monument changed its meaning fundamentally. What was once the ultimate private world is now shared with thousands of strangers daily. The spaces Hearst controlled absolutely are now controlled by park rangers and preservation specialists. The castle he built to escape the public now exists primarily for public education and entertainment. Marion Davies lived until 1961, dying a decade after Hearst. She never returned to San Simeon after leaving with Hearst in 1947. Her life after his death was quieter, divided between her remaining properties and occasional social appearances. She married for the first time at age 64, a brief union that ended with her husband's death shortly after. Her legacy is complicated by her relationship with Hearst and by Citizen Kane's unflattering fictionalized portrayal. Modern reassessment recognizes her genuine talent as an actress and her generosity during Hearst's financial crisis. The castle stands as monument to her as well. The hostess who made it function socially and the companion who provided emotional support during its decline. The Hearst family's relationship with the castle has evolved since the donation. They retain some access for private events, though the property is primarily public. Family members occasionally participate in events or programs at the castle. The relationship is generally positive, with the family supporting preservation efforts while respecting the property's public role. The financial cost of maintaining the castle remains substantial. The state of California funds basic operations through park admission fees and general fund appropriations. Major preservation projects require additional fundraising. The Hearst Castle Preservation Foundation and other organizations raise money for specific conservation work. The funding challenge is ongoing. The castle requires more maintenance than typical state parks due to its size, complexity, and the delicacy of its collections. Balancing public access with preservation needs while maintaining financial sustainability requires constant management attention. Some proposed improvements have been controversial. Proposals to build visitor centers or expand parking have faced opposition from those who want to preserve the hilltop's character. Questions about how much access to provide and what facilities to build involve balancing competing values of accessibility, preservation, and maintaining the historical environment. The castle will never be finished. This might be the most appropriate conclusion given Hearst's endless modifications and Morgan's constantly evolving designs. Construction stopped in 1937 due to financial crisis. Not because the vision was complete. Many planned elements were never built. Hearst continued proposing changes until his death. The incompleteness is authentic to the project's history. Preservation is itself a form of ongoing construction. Each repair replaces deteriorated material with new work. Each conservation treatment modifies the historical fabric slightly. The building that visitors see today is a palimpsest. Layers of original construction, decades of weathering, and years of preservation work superimposed on each other. The secret rooms will likely remain partially secret. Some spaces are too fragile or dangerous for public access. Others contain mechanical systems that must remain functional. Still others are simply too mundane or too small to be worth developing as tour stops. The mystery serves the castle's appeal. Knowing that hidden spaces exist beyond what visitors can see makes the visible spaces more intriguing. The castle functions as metaphor in ways Hearst might not have intended or appreciated. The golden cage he built for himself represents the isolation that wealth can create. The control mechanisms reveal insecurity beneath the confident exterior. The storage vaults full of possessions he couldn't use demonstrate the futility of treating objects as sources of happiness. The unfinished construction shows ambition exceeding even extraordinary means. The hilltop today is quieter than during Hearst's occupancy. The sounds of construction are gone. The party guests have departed. The exotic animals are elsewhere. Staff members give tours rather than attending to a demanding employer. The castle persists, beautiful and strange, excessive and impressive. For visitors climbing the winding road from the Pacific Coast Highway, the first sight of the towers rising above the hilltop produces genuine awe. The Mediterranean whiteness against California sky creates powerful visual impact. The pools spread like improbable mirages. The gardens frame carefully composed views. The architecture succeeds in its goal of impressing and overwhelming. Inside Casa Grande, the assembly room still showcases Gothic choir stalls and Renaissance furnishings. The refectory still seats guests at the long table beneath ancient flags. The Roman pool still glitters with its million glass tiles. The public rooms remain as Hearst intended, impressive and beautiful. But knowing about the hidden spaces changes how visitors experience these public rooms. The observation points above mean the spaces were watched as well as used. The storage vaults below ground the visible collections as merely the portion Hearst chose to display from vastly larger holdings. The tunnel systems remind visitors that armies of servants enabled the apparent luxury. The complete building includes both what is shown and what remains concealed. The castle tells multiple stories depending on what aspects receive emphasis. The architectural story focuses on Morgan's skill and the construction challenges overcome. The biographical story centers on Hearst's ambition and eventual decline. The social story examines entertaining customs and Hollywood glamour. The art history story catalogs the collections and their provenance. All these stories are accurate and incomplete. The most compelling story might be about the human need to create and control environment, pushed to an extreme by unlimited wealth. Hearst spent decades and millions of dollars creating an architectural world that expressed his vision and met his needs. The result was beautiful, impressive, and ultimately unsustainable. The castle he built became a burden rather than a refuge. The collections he assembled couldn't be properly managed. The control he designed into the architecture emphasized his isolation as much as his power. The golden cage he created imprisoned him even as it sheltered him. William Randolph Hearst had wealth that most people cannot imagine. He controlled media outlets that influenced millions. He entertained the most famous people of his era. He built a castle that still attracts thousands of visitors daily decades after his death. Yet the last years of his life were marked by financial stress, declining health, and enforced distance from his hilltop creation. The castle endures. Hearst is gone. The workers who built it are forgotten. Julia Morgan is remembered primarily for this single project despite a distinguished career. Marion Davies is known mainly for her relationship with Hearst. The building outlasts the people who made it. The architecture and collections remain while the drama and ambitions that created them fade into history. Visitors leaving the castle descend the winding road back to the coast highway, returning to the modern world from Hearst's creation. The transition is jarring. The castle exists somewhat outside normal time and place. Its Mediterranean architecture, European collections, and Gilded Age excess belong to different contexts than contemporary California. The dislocation is deliberate. Hearst created an alternate world on his hilltop, a place where normal rules and constraints didn't apply. For decades, he succeeded. The castle functioned as his private kingdom where his word was law and his taste determined reality. The success was temporary. Financial reality eventually intruded. Age and death ended the experiment. The castle transitioned from private fantasy to public monument. But while it lasted, Hearst's creation was genuine and complete. He built what he envisioned, lived as he pleased, and controlled his environment absolutely. The cost was isolation, eventual financial ruin, and the irony of being trapped by his own creation. The secret rooms embody this contradiction. Spaces designed for privacy became symbols of isolation. Observation points that enabled control revealed insecurity. Storage vaults that preserved collections became prisons for possessions. The hidden architecture that should have empowered instead emphasized constraint. If you found this exploration of Hearst Castle's construction, its secret spaces, and the price of building paradise valuable, please consider subscribing for more documentaries about American architectural history and the complex legacies of the nation's most ambitious builders. The castle still stands on its California hilltop. The towers still rise against the sky. The pools still reflect sunlight. The rooms still display their treasures. But now they belong to everyone and to no one. The private world became public property. The Golden Cage opened to admit millions of visitors who experienced briefly what Hearst experienced daily for decades, the beauty and excess of a monument built by power and maintained through control. The secret rooms remain, mostly hidden, holding their mysteries and reminding us that every surface conceals depths, every public face masks private complexity, and every golden cage, however beautiful, remains a cage.